What if I told you that the FIA has just ignited an internal war in Formula One? And that it all started with the sanction of Charles Leclerc in Miami? Because what seemed like a simple 20-second penalty actually uncovered the fury of the entire grid. Drivers openly questioning the FIA, the decisions that no longer convince anyone, and a paddock that is beginning to break from within. Was the FIA wrong? Or are we facing the beginning of a much bigger conflict that could change Formula One forever? The story begins at the 2026 Miami Grand Prix, a weekend that promised to mark a before and after for Ferrari. The team arrived with important improvements, showing real signs of recovery and once again placing itself in direct fight with the leading teams. In that context, Charles Leclerc was not only competing, he was building a key opportunity to relaunch his season. Everything pointed to a solid result, even a possible podium that would change the narrative of the championship. But Formula One does not forgive. In the last lap, when everything was at stake, chaos appears. A failure in the DRS system completely breaks the balance of the car, causing Leclerc to lose control in the middle of the straight. The spin not only ruins your fight on the track, but leaves the car with visible damage, especially to the rear and steering. From that moment on, what we see is not a driver looking for an advantage. It's a driver trying to survive with a car that no longer responds. And this is where the real conflict begins. During that last stretch, Leclerc is forced to cut several chicanes. Not as a strategic decision, but as a direct consequence of a car that simply could not turn correctly to one side. From inside the cockpit, the priority was clear: finish the race without causing a major accident. But from the outside, the reading was completely different. The FIA observes the situation from the regulations, not from the reality of the driver. And in a matter of hours, the verdict arrives: 20-second penalty. A decision that not only makes him lose positions, but also completely ignores the mechanical context that conditioned each of his movements on the track. This is the breaking point of Act 1. Because up to this point we could talk about a racing incident, one more sanction among many. But what makes this case different is the immediate reaction it generates. It's not just Ferrari protesting. It's not just Leclerc defending his position. It is the beginning of a much bigger noise within the paddock. The pilots are beginning to look at this decision with concern. Because if an obvious mechanical failure is not considered a valid justification, then no one is safe. The feeling that is beginning to grow is dangerous. The regulations are being applied without interpretation, without context, without understanding what is really happening inside the car at more than 300 kilometers per hour. And so, what began as a technical error on the last lap becomes the spark that ignites an accumulated tension. A tension that had been growing silently for some time, and that now, with this case, is about to explode. The breaking point comes when the sanction stops being an isolated event and becomes a trigger within the paddock. Because the FIA's decision does not remain on paper, it begins to generate immediate, tense, and above all, public reactions. What was previously discussed in private is now said in front of cameras. And that changes absolutely everything. The first to react are the pilots themselves. Not as rivals of Charles Leclerc, but as protagonists who perfectly understand what happened inside that car. The reading is clear. If a driver with obvious damage, with steering problems, and without full control of the car is sanctioned in this way, then the FIA criteria is completely disconnected from the reality of the track. Here we are no longer debating just one action. The entire system is being questioned. Statements are beginning to appear that reveal a discomfort that has been growing for some time. Some drivers point out the lack of consistency in decisions, others point directly to the rigidity of the regulations. And the most worrying thing, several agree on something key: they do not know what to expect in the next similar situation. That uncertainty is what really ignites the fury. Because in Formula One, where everything is decided in thousands, not having clarity on the limits is a huge problem. Pilots constantly live on the edge, making split-second decisions. If you add to that the interpretation of the regulation can vary or ignore the context, the result is a feeling of injustice that becomes impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Ferrari enters the scene with a firm stance. The team defends that Leclerc's action was a direct consequence of a technical failure, not a maneuver to gain an advantage. And here the discourse begins to escalate. It is no longer just a sports defense. It is a direct questioning of how the rules are being applied. But the most interesting thing happens outside of Ferrari. Rival teams, which would normally take advantage of any sanction to gain positions, are beginning to be cautious. They don't celebrate the penalty. They do not openly support it, because they understand that this can turn against them at any moment. And that silence says more than any statement. The paddock is divided into two clear streams. On the one hand, those who believe that the rules must be followed without exceptions. On the other hand, those who defend that the context is essential, especially in situations where there are obvious mechanical failures. This fracture is not minor, because it breaks one of the bases of sport, trust in refereeing criteria. And this is where the tension reaches a new level. This is no longer a controversial sanction. It is a credibility crisis. The drivers are not only angry, they are starting to lose trust in the FIA. This is the real core of the conflict in Act 2. The sanction against Leclerc stops being the main problem and becomes the symbol of something much bigger, a system that, for many on the grid, needs to change. Pilots no longer just question, they begin to position themselves. And that is the most dangerous thing for the stability of the championship. Because when the protagonists lose trust in those who regulate the sport, the conflict stops being sporting and becomes structural. The feeling within the paddock is clear. This cannot be repeated. From here, movements begin to emerge that show the magnitude of the problem. Internal meetings, conversations between pilots, and increasing pressure to review the penalty criteria. It's not just about the Miami case, it's about establishing a precedent. Because if the FIA maintains this line, the margin of interpretation will completely disappear, and with it, the driver's ability to manage extreme situations on the track. Ferrari, for its part, is not taking a step back. The team continues to argue that the sanction completely ignores the mechanical context of the incident, reinforcing the narrative that an injustice has been committed. But the most relevant thing is no longer the defense of a team. It is that this position is beginning to find an echo in other sectors of the grid. What seemed like an isolated complaint becomes a collective concern. And this is where the conflict reaches its peak. Because the FIA finds itself in a delicate position. If it gives in, it implicitly recognizes that its judgment was wrong. If it remains firm, it further fuels pilot discontent. There is no easy way out. Every decision from now on will be observed with a magnifying glass. The championship then enters a phase of uncertainty. Not only because of the fight on the track, but because of the climate that is breathed outside of it. Teams and drivers begin to compete with a new variable in mind, the fear of unpredictable decisions. And that completely changes the way you run, take risks, and compete. This is the true outcome of Act 3. There is no closure, there is no calm. There is an open rift between drivers and the FIA that threatens to grow race after race. The Miami sanction is no longer just a controversial episode. It is the beginning of a conflict that could redefine the rules of the game in Formula One. The sanction against Charles Leclerc at the 2026 Miami Grand Prix ends up being much more than a simple sporting decision. It becomes the reflection of a much deeper problem within Formula One. Because here we are not just talking about 20 seconds, nor about lost positions. We are talking about trust. And that is the basis of everything. What this episode left is a clear feeling within the paddock. The drivers no longer feel fully supported by the FIA's criteria. Rigidity in the application of the regulation, ignoring the context of an obvious mechanical failure, opens a dangerous door. One in which any situation out of control can end up being punished without nuances, without interpretation, without understanding what is really happening on the track. And that is the real impact. Because when drivers begin to doubt, when they are not clear about how their actions will be judged, the sport changes. It becomes more tense, more conservative, and at the same time more unstable. Uncertainty comes into play, and with it, a new way of competing. The FIA now has a key decision ahead of it. Not only about this case, but about the direction he wants to take. You can stand firm and reinforce a strict line of the regulations, or you can listen to the message that comes from the grid and adjust your criteria to restore that balance between rule and reality that drivers demand so much. Because if Miami 2026 made something clear, it is that this does not end here. This is just beginning. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.